So the question is from Paula Dwyer, and her question is, for Kit, did you assign Nadja a word count? What were your space constraints? And did you have any issues with your own top editors?
I'll answer those backwards. There were no issues with the top editors. It was an extraordinarily light back edit. It was, the kind of back edit that all of us want, which was there were tiny places where we over-explained or under-explained. And editors get lost in the tunnel just as much as writers do at a certain point. So it was really valuable to get those notes, but they were very small notes. I can't remember what the original contract was, but we always imagined it initially as a 7,000, 7,500 word piece. Nadja delivered considerably more than that. But I began to edit it to the size that I thought it was right. As it turned out, it was roughly 7,000 or 7,500 words. But at that stage, I thought it had the potential of being such an extraordinary piece. I was going to edit it to the length that I thought was right for the piece and make my argument with the editor if I needed to. It turned out I didn't need to. So there were no space constraints. And one of the extraordinary things about California Sunday was its art and photo department. And there were 3 photographers involved with this project. And one of the things that California Sunday became quite well known for was that how it used its photography to help tell the story itself, to not just enhance the story, but also become another form of the narrative. And so California Sunday was always going to give this enormous amount of space, and it did.
Thank you, Kit. We have great questions in the chat. One more about the writing process, and then we will go back to the reporting with questions in the chat. Nadja, you've told me before that Kit allowed you or helped you to extricate yourself from the piece. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So, as we had discussed, Kit and I really wanted the piece to be centered on the migrants' experience, and we wanted me to basically be invisible in the story. I did not want readers to be thinking about my journey. I wanted them to be thinking about the migrants' journey. And when I started drafting the piece, there were quite a lot of scenes where I found it difficult to not explain, basically to explain the scene in such a way where I wasn't there, because some of the interactions actually really did directly involve me. And so I ended up writing my first draft in first person, tried to use it as lightly as possible, but it was in first person. So people knew I was there. And Kit was able to find some really creative ways to be able to extricate myself entirely and make this purely observational. And one of the, I don't know if you want to talk about this, Kit, the scene with George, where I was actually there, but Kit was able to find a way to describe this so that it was, transparent that George was talking to guides. He was getting help from guides, but we found a way that, I didn't have to place myself there. And I think that the piece became so much stronger because of that. There's a lot of people who have asked me if I was actually on this journey. And I love getting that question, because to me, it shows that, they really weren't thinking about what I was doing during this process.
That is amazing. Thank you so much, Nadja, for that. Let's go back to the Darien Gap, to the reporting process and the logistics. Hendrik wants to know what were some of the security measures you put in place before and during the trip, and how do you two stay in touch? How do you decide to pack? What did you decide to pack, and all of those logistics?
Okay, I'll try to be brief on this. Basically, we decided that there were 2 kind of major safety concerns. One was the actual, I would say, physical concern. So the actual terrain and what kind of risks that could pose. So we're talking wildlife. We knew that a lot of people do die of venomous snake bites. People drown frequently, there's landslides. So there was that bit, and then there was the risks from two-legged creatures, humans. We knew that there were basically systematic sexual assaults, robbery at machete point, gunpoint happening every single day on the trail. And so the way that we tried mitigating these risks was, and I think the most important decision in all of our planning was, who were we going to hire as guides? So we needed these guides to know the terrain incredibly well so that we wouldn't get lost. We needed them to be trustworthy so that they wouldn't abandon us. And we also needed them to be kind of well respected in local circles. So our sense was that if we came across bandits, if we were with people who, these bandits who also were kind of known to be locals, if they perhaps had a reference point for each other, we might be in a lot better shape than if they were complete strangers to the region. So we were really lucky in that Carlos, the photographer, he had done years of legwork in the Darien Gap and had found guides who he had already crossed with and who were, he really trusted his life with. And so many of our reporting decisions revolved around them, and we really let them kind of dictate the pace of the trip, and we let those safety concerns really guide the trip. Just really quickly in terms of packing, so we tried to pack as light as possible, obviously. One change of clothes, camping gear, and in terms of materials that we brought, we had to, there was no electric power or signal obviously on the trail, so we had to bring an unbelievable amount of camera batteries. We knew that our cell phones weren't going to work. We rented a satellite phone, and we also had a GPS tracker where we pre-programmed a choice of 3 messages that we could send. And so every day we tried to send a message to our producer at PBS NewsHour. This was often more challenging than we had envisioned because the canopy was usually so thick that we often couldn't get a signal. And the last thing that we brought for safety was very expensive. It's basically anti-venom medication that you can only apply through IV. So we also had to carry a lot of IV bags. And that's an example where, if we hadn't been doing this with, without Pulitzer Center support, we never would have been able to afford that medication.
Thank you. We have amazing questions in the chat. So Alan wants to know if at any point in the journey you felt that you had made a mistake that could have been avoided, and what are your tips for young reporters attempting complicated, dangerous journeys?
So I can't remember a moment where we felt, or where I felt like we had done an error that was kind of unavoidable. I think with these types of trips, you have to expect the unexpected, and that's not to say that there weren't lots of hiccups along the way, but I think that when that happens, it's important just not to freak out and to remember that it's part of the process. And so I think that for, people who are planning ambitious reporting trips, I think that part of it is remembering that mistakes will happen, mess ups will happen, and that they're often recuperable. They're not necessarily the end of the world. I will share that I did make a a very strong technical error at the end of the trip when we were in the camp for migrants in Panama. Bruno and I were doing filming. I was recording on a voice recorder separate interviews for the magazine. Most of our camera equipment had broken or become damaged by water at that point, and we had to mix all of these different microphones and basically do a whole makeshift system. And in the process, when I was using my voice recorder, it seemed like I forgot to basically shift modes in some of the interviews that I did for my print piece. And so I returned to New York and I discovered that I had lost, I think it was 11 hours of some of the best interviews I had done. They were on the recorder, but they were completely inaudible. And I literally had a heart attack and felt like it was the end of the world, and that I was, holding this incredible and important story, and that, it just wasn't going to be possible anymore. And so I will say, to anybody that encounters these kind of disasters along the way, there's always a way for it to work out in the end. And it turned out that, there was an abundance of material, and we could work around that tape loss.
I'm sure we all identified with that panic moment.
Yeah, terrifying.
Kit, a couple of questions for you about, first of all, like a little bit more on how you help a reporter extricate themselves from a piece. And also, you mentioned that there were a couple of other previous stories on this subject. So how do you decide when it's worth doing your own version of a story or something that has already been done?
I'll answer the second question first. Both those stories weren't about the migrants coming through the Darien Gap. And so I thought there was an enormous opportunity to do something both quite extraordinary, but really valuable and really important. And so in this case, it was a really easy decision. One was 7 years old, one was, I think, 2.5 years old, and both had completely missed what I thought was the most important story. I don't think there's an easy answer to when you think something has been done. I think climate change reporters face this question every day, which is, on one hand, it is so written about and many people are numb to it. And on the other hand, it is so important. It's not too much to say that the fate of the world depends on how we respond to climate change, that you have to continue doing it. So the question isn't whether you're done. The question is, how can you do it in a way that will make people pay attention? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a different question. As for how do you extricate yourself, in some ways it's a kind of simple technical trick, which is you can write the piece the first way, which is you are there, they are talking to you, you are a participant. And then try to write the piece either neutrally, where you've removed yourself, or over the shoulder of a character. And one of the interesting things, in the process of editing the piece with Nadja, is that about halfway through, while Nadja was writing and I was editing, I asked her, she had so extricated herself from the piece at some point that the kind of sensation of walking through the rainforest and climbing up these extraordinarily steep and slippery trails had almost been stripped out of the piece. Mm. And I wasn't interested in how Nadja navigated that. I wanted to know how the Cameroonians and the Pakistanis, who were principal characters, navigated that. So I said, tonight, stop writing. After dinner, pour yourself a glass of wine, or even during dinner or while cooking, and just sit down with it, whatever's the most comfortable thing, a yellow pad of paper, your laptop. And then I had a set of questions. What was it like to, what was the humidity like? What was it like to go up, slip on those trails? and just write yourself some notes about that. Just don't worry about perfect sentences. Just write those sensations down. And then let's figure out how do we get those sensations in the piece, but they're not about you. And so there are lots of different ways you can do it, but some of it's just technical. Write the piece and remove yourself, or do it over someone's shoulder. So.
Nadja, just very quickly, I think let me see who asked this question. I think Genevieve wanted to know the timeline of the whole story, but very briefly, if you can tell us how long did you take with the logistics, the preparations, the trip itself, and then the writing process?
Okay, so I think that, as Kit mentioned, the actual pitching and approval process was really, really quick. We had been planning to go to the Darien, I believe, like as soon as maybe 3 or 4 weeks after the pitch was approved, which was really, really tight, considering there were so many moving parts. And the biggest moving part was actually our guide. So they ended up being, the head guide was like out of communication with no cell phone signal for 2 weeks. And he came back and said, the area is just kind of, it's just chock full of security. You're going to get caught. We have to postpone until they stop doing so many operations. So we postponed our trip, I think, once or twice. And I think we went probably a month and a half after pitch approval. Then I was on the ground in Colombia and Panama for 3 weeks, I believe. A few weeks later, I went to southern Mexico, spent another 2 or 3 weeks there. Then I spent a couple of months working on the PBS NewsHour series while, still trying to keep up with my characters and report on their journey, and, rewrite my notes. But I think that I earnestly, when I started writing to the time that I was able to give Kit these chunks of the draft, I think was 1 month, perhaps. And those chunks were all like in between 5 and 10,000 words. And I mean, Kit had to do like the most express edit. And I think, then it went really quickly, right, Kit? I mean, I think it was maybe.
I think I looked at the dates this morning. I think, you began to deliver late January, and or maybe late January, early February, and we delivered it to the copy desk in early March, right before COVID hit, actually.
Wow. Caroline, I have your question. I'm going to go to it in a second, but since we're talking about the magazine and the editing process, Jill wants to know, how did you know that Kit and California Sunday were the right choice? And did you try pitching elsewhere?
No, I didn't try to pitch elsewhere. I really felt strongly that this was a perfect story for California Sunday. I really admired their long form. I knew that they were ambitious, and I felt like they took chances on stories. So that's what, and as I mentioned, I'd already worked with Kit. I knew he was a great editor. So it was a very easy, it wasn't like a decision on my part. I was like, yes, this is a story for California Sunday. I'm going to send it to Kit.
Let me add one other thing, which is that California Sunday's mission was to write about the American West, Latin America, and the Pacific Rim. And there were a lot of reasons for that, but it was one of the few national publications that, certainly in magazines, whether it's in digital form or print form, that made Latin America a central part of the region that it covered.
Absolutely.
And nothing against the New Yorker, but that's not true of the New Yorker. It's not true of the Times Magazine, not true of the Atlantic. And it was one of the things that distinguished California Sunday from many of its competitors.
And one of the reasons why we missed the magazine. From Caroline Chen, Nadja, can you tell us more about how you built rapport early in the journey? You said you waited to ask for interviews, but how did you indicate that you were just getting to know people, not in reporter mode?
So yeah, maybe I should clarify. I guess, I was in reporter mode. I was completely upfront with everybody about who I was. And I was also, with a videographer and a photographer who, were always carrying around equipment. I think that, I had two different reporting processes for the television part and for the magazine part. And so with the television part, I knew that, if you don't get the footage like in situ, then there's not a story. And so those interviews had to happen in the Darien Gap. And I think that one of the things that made this experience less stressful was I never had the expectation that for the magazine piece, I was going to be carrying out the really, really long, in-depth interviews that any long form feature is going to require. I never had the expectation that I was going to do that on the trail. I had heard that when migrants are on this trail, they are gunning it, and they're not going to be interested, when they're hungry and wet and having a pretty miserable time, to just stop and chat with a journalist for 5 hours. And so that's where I just made my goal for the journey to build relationships with the migrants that then I could pick back up on once we had all arrived in Panama. And that's not to say that I didn't ask them reporterly questions on the way. And, I often referred to, I'd love to speak further with you when, once we arrive in Panama. But I was very much in kind of observer mode. I didn't know who my main subjects were going to be. And so I really just wanted to try to keep, my eyes very open, and get a feel for, who was I kind of feeling the greatest affinity to, who was already, who was I having a connection with already.
Nadja, in the last minute or so of this conversation, I want you to tell us a little bit about that extraordinary event that took place months after the story came out in the magazine and after the story came out in the PBS NewsHour. It was a only in New York kind of moment, and I would love to end this conversation with that.
Sure. So yeah, this is a fun story. It was wintertime in New York, and I heard a ring at our doorbell, and Bruno and I were living on the second floor of a brownstone, and I kind of, opened the window and peered my head out and saw a delivery person below, and I hadn't ordered any food. So I explained, I'm sure it's for the downstairs neighbors. Can you just, go down the step and ring their bell? And he said, oh yeah, okay, sure, thanks. And he turned around, and then he did this, he just kind of swiveled and like looked back out the window, and he said, Nadja? And I said, yeah. And I had no idea who this person was. They wore a hood, they had a mask on, they were all bundled up. And I went downstairs, and this person, their English was not terrific, but he was able to communicate with me, some key words like Darien. And he started showing me his cell phone, and he pulled up the first PBS NewsHour piece that Bruno and I had done. And he was pointing at it, and, we realized not only had he done the Darien Gap trip, but we actually had spent days together walking through the Darien. And the last time that I had seen him was on the side of a riverbank. And he was part of a group of Bangladeshis who we came across. They had been robbed 4 times. they had no more clothes left, no money, no food left. And so they joined our group. And I hadn't seen him since Panama. So the coincidence was just absolutely unreal that here he was on our doorstep. And it turned out that he worked out of a restaurant really close by and was moving to our neighborhood. And I have since moved. I let him know where I was living, and just a few weeks ago, he messaged me and said, I'm in your neighborhood, and we saw each other on the street. So that was fun. So yeah, the chances are basically nil.
It's extraordinary. Thank you so much, Nadja and Kit. I wish we could continue, but as Kit would say, is the power of the unspoken, and knowing when to stop is a good skill. So I'm going to follow that advice. Thank you for your leadership. We are truly, truly inspired. And thank you also to the Overseas Press Club, to the board, to Patty and to Chad for encouraging this conversation. And with that, I will turn it over to Patty.
It was an absolutely fabulous and fascinating conversation. And thank you so much, Marina, Nadja, and Kit. And we will try to do it again sometime. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.